What'd you like about the Lincoln movie?
Well, the Lincoln movie could be compared to what has been done in the past. And, you know, the Henry Fonda, young Mr. Lincoln, Sam Waterston, and his portrayal of Lincoln. So how did this movie differ? How did the actors differ in their interpretation of Lincoln? I think the thing that I liked the most was that Dave Lewis was really the epitome of Lincoln. I mean, when you looked at his portrayal of Lincoln, it came as close to Lincoln as you could probably come on the screen. And the other performance that was done by the actor who played William Seward, I think, was equally well done. The casting for that character was extremely well done.
And Stewart was the Secretary of...
Seward, yeah. Seward was the Secretary of State.
Secretary of State.
So the combination, I think they played well together. And that was very accurate because William Seward had unlimited access to Lincoln, which, much to the chagrin of other cabinet members like Chase and Wells. So that was quite accurate, and you could see the growing understanding and friendship between the two. That it didn't start out that way when Lincoln first took office. So I thought that was well done. The downside of any film portrayal of Lincoln, any historical event, is that they tend to gin up the audience, the viewing audience, with an over-dramatization of the event or the characters. And the events are speeded up in time, of course, because of the time limitations of the movie. So that's always a downside. I thought that the political wrangling that went on with the senatorial passing of the 13th Amendment was well done. It emphasized the sausage making that people talk about in terms of legislation.
How realistic was that?
Well, I think it was very realistic because you have to keep in mind that at that time, before the advent of the civil service examination, that political patronage was a payoff. Whether you were being made the head of the government land office in Springfield, Illinois, or you were collecting the tariff at the Port of Boston or Port of New York, or becoming a postmaster at some large city. This is the way politicians supported or paid their political patrons. So that was quite accurate. In some minds, it probably called into question Lincoln and this iconic view that many Americans have of Lincoln, that he was this pristine individual who would never have delved in those levels of politics. But Lincoln, above all things, Lincoln was a masterful politician. And this is the way politics was conducted, really, at that point in time.
What I got out of the movie was how determined Lincoln was. But he was also a very depressed person. And I don't think the movie really captured that part of his character. Mm-hmm. Is the manic depressant type individual he was, even though he was a determined individual. Maybe because he was a depressed individual, that's why he was so determined, I'm not sure. But the movie didn't really capture some of his depressed states. It captured the weight of the country and how it aged him. I think in the movie it talks about, I think one of the senators were saying how he aged so much in the last few months or something like that.
I believe Grant meant that he had aged 10 years since the last time he'd seen him.
Yeah, something like that.
First of all,
They were sitting on the porch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the question regarding mental stability, yeah, I think you have to compare Lincoln to Mary Lincoln, Mary
Well,
Todd
both
Lincoln.
crazy.
Mary Todd Lincoln, medical historians today basically view her as manic depressive, as a bipolar, what's known today as bipolar. And she had these manias that are symptomatic of bipolar depression. One of them was the idea that she was going broke, which her son Robert tried to convince her, get her out of the thinking of that she didn't have enough money to live on. And the other was buying clothes, of course, which was her shopping trips were legion. She spent 11 of them in New York and I believe also Philadelphia during the 4 years that Lincoln was president. But what about Lincoln? Where does that put him? Lincoln was a melancholy individual who kind of fell back into his own little man cave during discussions with people, quite to their consternation sometimes, that he kind of, distanced himself from people. His melancholy really was derived from some early losses in his life of 3 significant females. His mother at the age of 9 in 1818, his sister Sarah, who died in childbirth in 1828 when he was a teenager, and then of course the famous Anne Rutledge. Historians have debated just how close the relationship was. The more current biographers accept the fact or the belief that there was some kind of a verbal agreement between them that of courtship, possible, with possibility of marriage in the future. And that was in 1835 with her acquiring typhoid fever and then dying from it. Mm-hmm. So these were 3 prominent females in his life, and it led to a kind of a feeling of abandonment that Lincoln never really got away from. And it really, I think, adversely affected his personality in many ways.
But yeah, he almost, in a way, emotionally abandoned Robert, his son.
His son, what's kind of ironic is Lincoln and his relationship with Robert was somewhat similar to Abe's relationship with Thomas Lincoln, his father, Robert's grandfather. Abraham Lincoln looked at Thomas Lincoln, I think, as in a negative fashion because he was uneducated. Not this was due to no fault of his own. It was just simply because of what had happened to his father at such an early age. But with Robert Lincoln just had a different personality. And when he was growing up as the first child, his father was gone 6 months out of every year on the 8th Judicial Circuit in Illinois. 3 months in the spring usually and about 3 months in the fall. So he had very limited access to his father. And the mother was basically a single parent mom raising the boys at home while the father was out there on the trail, excuse me, riding the circuit. So he didn't see a whole lot of his father. He would tell a friend years later, I probably had less than 10 minutes of time with my father when he was president. Lincoln was a micromanager of the war, and it really adversely affected their relationship.
I think the movie portrayed that micromanaging, especially in the scenes where he's in the room where the telegraph is.
Mm-hmm.
Being involved.
He spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, being involved late nights and
Mm-hmm.
all this. Now, I'm going to ask you a couple questions and see if you can answer these things. Okay. Did many folks in the North think it was not worth fighting over and that they should just let the Southern states secede?
Well, when you say many, I mean that's
Many folk.
Many folk. That's a tough question to answer in terms of a numerical figure. There were.
I think the point here is that
Some of the significant figures, like for example, Winfield Scott, who was the head of the Army, the commanding general of the Army when Lincoln became president, felt that way, that the South, to engage in a civil war with the South was not the right way to go. He would eventually come around to,
so he was a pacifist.
Well,
The general was a pacifist.
his suggestion was the Anaconda Plan to blockade the South, which
Sanctions.
yeah, which basically what it came down to, and it was a very successful effort once it was implemented. So,
So what we do today with certain countries, like Iran, through the sanctioning by the UN, was similar to this Anaconda.
The Anaconda Plan.
Anaconda
Mhm.
Plan.
Well, the Anaconda Plan was far more strenuous and restrictive than the blockade that we have of Iran right now, and it got us into some difficult situations with foreign powers like Britain and France for a while there, that where they were objecting to this because it came into contradiction to the way we were handling some of the South American countries, Peru at that time, in terms of recognizing the de facto government versus the de jure government that was that had been in power, and whether or not our ships had access to their ports. The British brought this up to Seward. Seward kind of danced his way around that question, and he was very good at doing this. Seward, in general, I think, did a very good job in terms of handling foreign powers and preventing the kind of mishaps that many people were afraid were going to befall America during the Civil War.
So I think that there was probably a big part of the United States at the time, before the war actually commenced, but the rumblings were starting that they were anti-war, that they were, especially in New York. I think New York probably was a good barometer of this at the time. Was that my understanding is that they didn't want the Civil War. Kind of similar, they didn't want us to go into Iraq or Iran, or not Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. That even if certain things really question statehood, the glue of the country, that a lot of times New York has a tendency to be, they're more worried about how it'll affect business.
Precisely.
The immediate than the long term.
New York.
The long term, effects of what's going on.
It was said at that time that New York bankers would say that the South is our best customer, and they were. New York, the banking industry in New York basically financed the acquisition of slaves through middlemen, financed the shipping and the insurance on the ship, and they underwrote all this, and that was so when the cotton was no longer available to them, that was a real blow to the banking industry, and that's the business of New York is business. So I think that was the underpinning for that.
It's important to understand that not all northern states were really for the war at the beginning, and not even all states, even though they were supporting the North, were really that enthusiastic of participating in this long 4-year war.
Well, yeah, take for example the Midwest.
Because of the interconnections economically.
One of the concerns of the Midwestern states in the North was the apprehension that the Mississippi River, as a conduit for their farm produce, was going to be cut off to them. And they were very concerned about that until we got to the point where the rail situation was such that the excess produce could be shipped to the east, to other states, and then eventually, of course, to foreign countries like the wheat surplus and so forth. So that was a concern.
So when was it that the northern states, the ones that were sitting on the fence, or were, I would classify them as more passive, ended up really galvanizing for the war effort? I mean, was there a point in the war where that all the northern states actually said, okay, we have to win? In the beginning, it was like, well, do we really need to go to war? Maybe not. But there must have been a point where the northern states solidified and went full bore with the cause.
Well, some historians, like, for example, James McPherson, in his Battle Cry of Freedom, point to a specific time in the war when people bought into the idea that this was really their war. Up until that time, and that was like around 1863, the war was not going well for the Union up until the summer of 1863. So there was even less incentive to really be positive about participating in it and supporting it. The victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and then in November at Chattanooga when Grant's army defeated Braxton Bragg at Chattanooga and broke the siege there, introduced Lincoln to the idea that of announcing a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction in December of 1863. So
these are all prior to the setting in the movie.
Right, exactly. The movie basically dealt with the last 4 months of Lincoln's life, which was the wrangling over the 13th Amendment. So the Northern support for the war grew even more tenuous during the draft, where many men began to to really see that this was their fight too, not just for volunteers. The volunteers had been pretty much used up to that point. The volunteer spirit was dying out. Many people did not see a light at the end of the tunnel, and they were really horrified by these catastrophic casualty lists. So it's not an easy question to answer. You get a mixed picture of support for the war based on your geographic place and time, and also just who was winning on the battlefield. Civil wars are seldom popular, so
there was a business component.
There was a business component,
there was a psychological component,
yeah, agricultural component. So
okay, next question: what was the importance of keeping the Union together? This kind of dovetails into the first question.
Well, the Union, in keeping the Union together, what you're doing basically is acknowledging, or forcing acknowledgement in this case, of a higher form of federalism than existed with the Articles of Confederation. The way the South viewed the Union prior to the Civil War was that the states were co-equal and actually could refuse to comply with federal law.
When you mean by co-equal, you mean co-equal to the federal government, not amongst each other.
Well, they were
that all states had that states' rights and states' sovereignty was above federal.
Well, according to the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. So the focus of the Articles was the state. With the Constitution, with the ratification on a state-by-state level of the Constitution, there was a tacit acknowledgement of a higher form of federalism where in the preamble of the Constitution, which states, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, More perfect than what? Than the Articles of Confederation.
Mm.
So they're acknowledging a higher form of federalism. The southern states viewed this differently. And you have to go back to an earlier period, 1800, 1801, with the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves written by Jefferson and Madison. That's basically stated that if a state viewed a federal law as contrary to their best interests, that they could just simply nullify it and just not comply with it. Mm. Of course, these resolves were written as in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts that were unpopular during the presidency of John Adams. So this was kind of the precursor of nullification that was being advocated by John Calhoun, the senator from South Carolina, during the Jackson presidency, when he was basically suggesting that the South could secede in opposition to the tariffs that were kind of viewed negatively in the South so, and then fast forward to the 1830s or the 1840s, when Lincoln was in the Congress for 2 years, 1847 to 49, when Calhoun said during the discussion over the territory of Oregon, when it was being viewed for statehood, when he would say that the idea that all men are created equal is, quote, both false and dangerous. That's what he's doing there is basically stating that the American narrative is wrong. That this American narrative that all men are created equal, which was basically accepted by most Americans as something that would eventually be brought about, especially after Congress passed a law that said after 1808, on January 1st, 1808, you can no longer import African slaves into America. That it would eventually die out and all men would be created equal. This would be an institution that would wither on the vine and then die out. So, but the South had the opinion that if things didn't work out their way, that this was their option of just leaving the Union. This is a debatable point. It's something that the constitutional lawyers would have a field day with. How you view the constitutionality of a state saying that we can leave the Union. What the Civil War did basically is it ended that question by stating that the Union is inviolate. That once you joined the Union, there was no way out of it. In fact, some presidents, even Andrew Johnson, who was not an advocate of Lincoln's civil rights agenda in any way, shape, or form, believed that, as he said, quote, there is no such thing as Reconstruction, end quote, meaning that the South had never left the Union. And this Reconstruction was basically formulated around this question as to whether or not the South had actually left the Union. If it had left the Union, then Congress would take the steering wheel in terms of proceeding with how Reconstruction would work. And because of their powers to either accept or reject representatives into the Congress based on their credentials and their legislative powers. Now, if you believe that Congress, if you believe that the South had not left the Union, then basically the president, because of his powers of amnesty and pardoning, that he would basically direct Reconstruction.
Okay, so in the movie, they're debating the 13th Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the state House. It's in the state.
It's in the Senate.
It's in the Senate. Now, the states that seceded from the Union
Mm-hmm.
during this war period, were those states represented in the Senate?
No, they would not be. What's interesting is that during the Andrew Johnson's administration,
They're out. They're out of the Senate because they left. They,
Right.
quote, kind of
Right.
left the Union.
exactly.
Well, so they did leave.
Yeah.
They didn't. They didn't have representative government.
Well, all but four of them. You know, there were four states that were that had slave populations that remained loyal to the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. They're represented there. And then in 1863, then you have West Virginia that begins to represent Virginia itself. But so they're there, and they represent like around maybe 400,000 enslaved people. Many of the soldiers that would fight for the Union, black soldiers, would come from those border states, those loyal border states that had slaves. But in December of 1865, when Congress, when the House of Representatives would reconvene after this long recess that they had, they would find some of these people that were in the that had been in the seceded states had been basically sent back to Congress, and according to the laws that had been enacted prior to that or after that, these people would not have been eligible. For example, people that had served in the Confederate government or high-ranking officers above the rank of colonel. So these people were basically told to leave the Congress and return to their states because they had not been, I guess, reconstructed, whatever that meant to them. So, and
from all this, it gives me the impression they did leave officially.
Well, that's
this idea that they never left. I don't know if it would hold water.
Yeah, Lincoln.
It seems to me that they did leave.
This was a question that Lincoln tried to avoid.
Why would he have tried to avoid that?
Well, he tried to avoid it because I think he saw it as clouding the issue. It was an academic clouding of the issue, where Lincoln wanted to just get on with it and go forward with Reconstruction and stop wrangling over these petty differences as he probably viewed them. But he worked with Congress. This was something Andrew Johnson didn't do. He certainly didn't work with the abolitionists in Congress, and unfortunately, even though the conservative or the moderate wing of the party wanted to work with him, his failure to work with the moderate wing of the party doomed his presidency. So, but this was something that Lincoln didn't really want to delve into because he felt that it kind of clouded the issue.
Interesting. So, just in conclusion, just give your opinion of the movie and
well, I think it was terrific.
Of Lincoln, represented in the movie.
I think that the casting and the portrayal of what happened and how these key players interfaced and acted and was really tremendous. I thought it was very favorable. I think it set us the bar a little bit higher for the portrayal of Lincoln, especially the way Daniel Day-Lewis was a spitting image of Lincoln. It's hard to imagine seeing anyone, a Lincoln reenactor, who would best his performance in terms of his physical features and the way he acted, his mannerisms, his speech, his
humor. I think it's also humor.
Everything about him. I mean, it was the whole laundry list of the way you think Lincoln should have looked and acted and talked. I think was beautifully done. you know, just when you think you've got the best possible performance, of course, somebody comes along and does it a little bit better. But, you know, Hollywood never gets tired of portraying Lincoln. I'm glad to see that they did this because, yeah, you know, Lincoln, there's a lot to be learned from Lincoln. There's a lot of confusion, misunderstanding about Lincoln, his position on slavery, a lot of things. His upbringing, his view of religion. There's a lot of misunderstanding about Lincoln that I think the modern generation would do well to study his life in depth and get a better understanding. And you know, this was an older technology, of course, back then. But many of the ways that Lincoln solved problems and dealt with life could be, you could, you know, learn from it today. So
what was Lincoln's religion?
Well, that's a totally different story here. Lincoln, a lot of historians really inaccurately portray Lincoln's position on religion and just how religious he was. Some of them mentioned in the presidential series, book series on Lincoln, it was mentioned that, you know, he never attended church and you know, he was not a religious person. Well, it's not true. You know, the leading authorities on Lincoln and religion show Lincoln attending church.
What
the
kind
Presbyterian,
of church?
the Presbyterian Church, yeah, in Springfield and in Washington. And he was a deeply religious man. All you have to do is look at the second inaugural address. More, as one historian, Ron White, put it, it was a sermon, basically, instead of a speech. As I recall, counting and looking at the speech myself, counting the word God in it, I think it was 11 times. Maybe he used the word Almighty once, but I mean, that was really a remarkable statement on his part about his belief in God. Maybe not a formalized religion. Lincoln never really formally joined a church. His wife did.
See, I viewed Lincoln in the same context as maybe Jefferson, in terms of religious, yeah, a deist instead of the theist. Yeah,
Lincoln was, I don't think Lincoln was really into religious ideology, adhering to the strict norms of any given religion. And that was required sometimes, especially during his father and mother's time period in Indiana, where the Baptist church that they belonged to, there were, you know, there were a sects of the Baptist church where there was a litany of beliefs that you had to comply with in order to become a member of the church. So I don't think Lincoln, that was the type of thing that Lincoln was looking for. He was, you know, he liked more latitude in his religious belief. So.
Okay, well, that concludes the video. Thank you for your opinion.
For what it's worth.